Good afternoon, everyone. Hello, greetings from all parts of the world, wherever you're joining us from. My name is Salamet Tsereteli Stevens. I'm the president of the Georgian Association in the US, and it is my pleasure to be hosting and opening this session in our series called Making of Modern Georgia. And we have a wonderful panel today for you to speak about the topic, How Do Small States Survive? Highlighting lessons from Georgia. Today we have Professor David Darchiashvili moderating this conversation between Kornely Kakachia and Neil MacFarlane. And it is a pleasure to introduce David Darchiashvili, who's a professor in international relations, history and regional studies at the Arts and Science Department of Ilia State University in Tbilisi, Georgia. And until recently, he was also a director of the Center for Russian Studies at a Georgian non-governmental think tank. He has a long list of achievements, accomplishments, and publications, among which I would highlight the U.S. connection with Johns Hopkins University, Stanford University in the U.S., as well as a number of engagements in Europe. In 2010 to 2012, he was heading the Georgian delegation to the EU Eastern Partnership Interparliamentary Assembly, and as I mentioned, has published a number of studies and co-authored a number of books and academic articles on Georgia's modern history, security problems, civil-military relations, and so forth. And so he will be moderating today's conversation. If you are attending, you will see that we have a way for you to get involved and ask questions in the Q&A session when that opens up. And that Q&A will be moderated as well, so our participants can answer your questions in real time. At the end, we will share some resources that you can follow up with, as well as see a bookshelf of recommended readings that our guests are suggesting for attendees to read. That is linked to our Georgian Association website, and we will invite you to share the previously recorded sessions and attend our future events, which will continue to happen throughout the spring. So again, welcome, and thank you very much for being a part of this activity and this event today. Over to you, David.
Thank you, Salome. And well, hello to everybody. It's my privilege and honor and pleasure to take part in this webinar, and especially introduce and then moderate the discussion of the presentations of very prominent scholars and experts on not only on Georgia but on regional affairs encompassing the Caucasus, Black Sea area, and the post-Soviet space, if I may say so. And those of you who are interested in such topics, and also generally in security studies, international relations, probably the today's speakers should be familiar with me, but familiar for you. But let me still highlight particular biographical details. Professor Neil MacFarlane was educated in Dartmouth College at Oxford University, and then for years and years was associated with Oxford University with the Department of Politics and International Relations, which he was heading for several years. Well, he had also affiliations with Queen's University in 96, for instance, or with the University of Virginia. But then eventually he again remained settled in Oxford University, having currently the emeritus professorship there, and also being affiliated with I loved it, with the Nizami Ganjavi program, which is very interesting and focuses on Azerbaijan, but also beyond. What is also worth noting that Professor Neil MacFarlane received the honorary doctorate at Tbilisi State University in 2011 and for years led doctoral program of international relations at the same Georgian University. As to Kornely Kakachia, he represents this very Georgian university, Tbilisi State University, namely. He is a professor also in international relations. And besides that, he is a Jean Monnet chair at this university. And mm, Also, what is interesting that one of the prominent Tbilisi-based think tanks, the Institute of Politics, is led by Kornely. He is a director of this institute. So for him, the focus is, as I mentioned, as much as for Neil, just general security, international politics, but also with the particular focus on the region, on Georgian affairs, Black Sea, Caucasus. Professor Kakachia is a co-editor of the book, whose title is almost the same as our webinar's title. That is the Georgian Foreign Policy in 21st Century Challenges for a Small State, published by IB Taurus Publishing House. And well, there is a list of publications of Professor MacFarlane as well as Professor Kakachia. I will not read now everything what is in their respective biographies, and giving floor to Neil for the beginning, and expecting he gives the theoretical perspective to the issue of small state survival, and then asking Kornely to dive deeper into the Georgian case. Let me with that stop here and give floor to our presenters. Neil, floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Kornely. Sorry, David, whatever. And thanks to the organizers for putting this together. It's an honor to be here. I apologize to begin with that I'm the only non-Georgian person on this panel. And I'm always conscious of this because everybody, all the Georgians know much more than I do about their own country. And I respect that. Now, I want to talk about several things. First of all, small state theory in the context of where we are in world politics and what has changed since the end of the Cold War. And then I'm going on to see how, very briefly, because I'm leaving the detailed analysis of Georgian issues to Kornely, my good friend. And then I'll go on to a question that was asked along the way, which is Georgia a universal case for small states in international relations or not? And I will tell you my answer to that question in due course. Anyway, concerning small state theory in a very general sense, this is a neglected area in international relations theory. IR theory is generally focused on the great powers and on mega issues such as power, the balance of power, international political economy, norms in international relations, and international organization per se. To the extent that the discipline deals with small states, the basic question that arises is the power differential. Small states, by definition, are incapable of affecting the system as a whole, or, except at the margin, the balance of power between great powers, because they are too weak. Instead, to the extent that great powers compete over them, the question is whether they can survive as independent actors in international politics. Now, that is effectively a realist conception of international politics, one that I just presented, because it's what dominated before the end of the Cold War. And this power politics image of world affairs became less popular after the end of the Cold War. As a result of the collapse of the USSR, great power tension lessened. There was more space for the independent agency of small states. And going local, the constituent republics of the USSR became independent and they forged their own futures. Or so it seemed at the time. In the meantime, during this period, the post-Cold War period, a rules-based liberal order carried the day, focusing on international norms, international law, human rights, the United Nations as a principal organization in international relations. That all grew more prominent in the discipline of IR and in the practice of states, large and small. The international economy during this period, in the meantime, was driven by globalization, the increasing integration of economies across state borders and across regions, producing ever greater economic interdependence. In Europe, meanwhile, the European Economic Community coalesced into a European Union and developed substantial uniformity in law and economic regulation. And through the Schengen Agreement, it created free movement across member state borders. In contrast, thinking about NATO, the existence of NATO was drawn into question by the end of the Cold War because it was seemingly no longer necessary. After all, where was the threat? State security as a dominant concept was increasingly challenged by the notion of human security, which is the security of human beings rather than states. And in practice, there were significant cuts in defense spending throughout NATO. I could go on here, but suffice it to say that the traditional understanding of international relations as great power competition and balance of power seemed to be over in the 1990s. That world looks very different from the world we are living in now. That world rested on uncontested US primacy, if not hegemony. Its major prior competitor, the USSR, had collapsed. This world is one in which the US is weaker and less predictable. Russia has recovered. China has emerged as a major competitor around the world. The notion of small states, particularly those who sit between major powers, the notion of these states as objects of a zero-sum competition has returned, and they have correspondently lost a degree of agency. In the meantime, major war is back in the system after a long pause. Defense spending is increasing. States are rearming. Globalization, at least in part, seems to be challenged by a sanctions policy in the United States, and so on. One could be forgiven for suggesting that we are returning to the famous maxim of Thucydides in the Melian dialogue. The strong do what they will, and the weak accept what they must. That, to me, is the broader political environment or background for the question we have before us. How do small states survive in these troubled times? The shift in the structure of the international system from one of benign hegemony to growing competition between the great powers, and their growing aggressiveness in that competition makes the question for small states all the more important. Let's move on to what theory suggests specifically about small power survival. Classic small state theory suggests two strategies for small states in difficult regions. One, they can balance against the principal threat. In Georgia's case, that would, I assume, be Russia. So you balance against Russia through developing ties with the West or China or whatever. So the problem with the other possibility is bandwagoning, cooperating with the threat to reduce the danger of the principal threat. That's to say, Russia's your problem, you cooperate with Russia. If these are the two choices, the normal expectation is balancing behavior rather than bandwagoning behavior, to move against the threat rather than to move to the threat. However, the success of balancing depends on the existence and willingness of a powerful friend to assist against the threat. This is a problem that Georgia has faced. Also, as we know from the current position within NATO, the major partner may change its mind on the issue of security guarantees. I'm happy to move on with that in Q&A if necessary. Bandwagoning theory, in contrast, is an unlikely choice in theory. The simple reason for that is that the partner may see your cooperation and goodwill as effectively surrender, an invitation to take more and eventually swallow you. There is a third option, which isn't really explored in theory, which is to attempt to avoid the choice by trying to shore up good relations with both the principal threat and its enemy. There's always problems. The problem here, to my mind, is that the small state really doesn't satisfy either great power, and trying to weave through the middle generally ends badly. Empirically, all three behaviors have been present in small state practice. It is not obvious which behavior is more successful historically, particularly because the power and the will or willingness of potential possible partners varies. So where does Georgia fit in this since independence as a small state attempting to survive? I won't talk about the Gamsahurdia period. It was bitter and short. I think we can say that Shevardnadze wanted to build solid relations with the West while taking care not to alienate Russia, not least given the informal occupation of South Ossetia and Abkhazia. Mikhail Saakashvili tilted dramatically towards the US, the EU, and NATO, and was visibly hostile to a re-emerging Russia. As we know, that ended badly with the 2008 war. As for Georgian Dream, and I realize this is a sensitive topic, they started out with a fairly balanced attitude, pursuing Saakashvili's lines of developing relations with the West, but avoiding anti-Russian rhetoric. As time and they became more aware of the expectations of the EU and the US on economic governance, the rule of law, human rights, they seem to have retreated from the active pursuit of membership in the EU and NATO, and its positions appeared to be increasingly close to those of people like Viktor Orban, or for that matter, Vladimir Putin. So turning to an ultimate issue before the conclusion, Is Georgia a universal case of small state security, or are there no universal recipes because of geopolitical and geocultural differences? I would suggest that there's no universal recipe. A lot of it depends on where the state is geographically as a country. A lot of it depends also on the normative character of the region in which you find yourself as a state. I'll conclude here with a few examples. Let's take the state of Luxembourg. It's a very little country between two traditional rivals, Germany and France. It got run over many, many times. And then the two threats were convinced to bury the hatchet and cooperate rather than fight. Luxembourg first survived, when it did, as a buffer between two rival powers. Now, it survives within an EU and NATO framework. Security for Luxembourg is no longer a problem. That probably is the cause of the fact that their armed forces have fewer than 1,000 personnel. Speaking of buffers, there's also Switzerland. It has a long history of neutrality in a very difficult region. It survived because of the terrain. It's very difficult to conquer, a lot of mountains. Its population, moreover, is united in their defensive independence. Thirdly, it has a well-trained and well-armed citizen army, and they have shown in the past that they are willing to fight when challenged. This is known in strategic studies as the porcupine strategy. Small animal, many sharp thorns. Stay away. Is Georgia, Iceland is my final example. And now, I don't think that there's any particular mystery here. It's a very small state. It also has an extremely small armed forces. It has survived a very long time as an island nation. In general, it's just probably too far away and too poor to bother with. And until recently, nobody saw much point in taking it. I say until recently because the melting of the Arctic changes the incentive structure for major states. Also, trying to take it would immediately produce a reaction given its membership in NATO. I could have gone on here to Israel and that other small country, Canada, which is not small geographically, but as a foreign policy entity, it is. But my time is up. I'll conclude with reference to Georgia. It's in a very difficult situation. One, it has an aggressive former colonial power as a neighbor. Two, there is an evolving power imbalance within the Caucasus sub-region. The major beneficiary there is Azerbaijan at the expense of Georgia and Armenia. Third, and apologies again, so far as I can tell from looking at the Georgian armed forces, Georgia lacks any significant capacity to defend itself. And finally, this is no secret, there are significant internal divisions in Georgian politics. Now, if you want me to attempt to deliver a recipe for what Georgia should do, you'll have to wait for the Q&A. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Neil, for very interesting and thought-provoking introductory remarks. I also expect that during the discussion and the Q&A, we will cover some aspects of this small state foreign and security policy choices. And I personally wonder what is the role of norms and values in this respect. But before that, let me turn to Kornely. Kornely, please, floor is yours. We are looking for your presentation.
Thank you very much for invitation, and thank you to our host organization, Georgian Association, for this very timely discussion. As you know, unfortunately, we cannot do this kind of discussion freely in Georgia because of this current circumstances and because of the pressure towards civil society and think tanks, universities, and etc. So I think this is a great initiative. Basically, what I would like today to say is some of the topics we already, I think Neil already mentioned. So I will skip, we can go to the next slide. Basically, I will skip this part where there was some part of the definition of the small state, and I think that we agree that Georgia is a typical small state by all definitions. And if you look to the Georgia's foreign policy since its independence, it was a permanent search for sustainable security, and that was, I think, this is still ongoing on, and there is no formula which kind of fits Georgian national interest. And if you look to different administration which rule Georgia, each of them, tried different foreign policy, and they were trying between balancing and bandwagoning and many others. But I think Georgia still in search of this its own foreign policy orientation. And next slide, please. And if we look to the region also, where Georgia located, is quite difficult region, especially recently, because of this geopolitical changes, especially after Russian invasion of Ukraine. Many small states, including Georgia, actually is feeling under the pressure, and it's kind of clear, that Georgia, as it was mentioned already, doesn't have a security guarantees, and we all know that Georgia is not a member of NATO. Georgia is not member of EU, and also recently what we see that Georgia is also got more self-isolated country, and it's also got politically isolated from the West because of its government anti-Western or anti-European rhetoric. And I think this geopolitical vulnerability of Georgia is also kind of understood by Russia and by other countries as well. And also, it's very interesting when we talk about Georgia, we should also consider regional setting, because in South Caucasus we traditionally had some sort of influence from regional countries and non-regional countries as well. So, namely Russia, Iran, Turkey, and the United States and European Union. Now, I think if we look to the present situation, the competition in South Caucasus a little bit became more fierce, because we have a new actors here, including, for instance, India, Gulf states, some other, like China is also trying. So I think this makes small states like Georgia and all other regional states in South Caucasus a little bit more. Gives them a little bit chance to maneuvering. And basically, there's several key concepts which we can use to define or argue about where Georgia's foreign policy heading. And first, it was already mentioned, that there's some people in Georgia who thinks that Georgia and present government under Georgian Dream actually they trying bandwagon towards Russia, but bandwagon by stealth. And we know the reason, because if you do this very openly, there's a very strong public pressure, and government cannot really do because of the 2008 war and all these consequences. There's also a lot of discussion, basically, recently what kind of foreign policy we have on the Georgian Dream. Georgian Dream claims that this is multi-vector or multi-aligned foreign policy, which some we can agree on that, but also it doesn't really really fit the classical term of the multi-vector foreign policy, because in multi-vector foreign policy, in case of small states, if Georgia wants to pursue that kind of foreign policy, then you should have a balance, basically. And especially what Georgian government tells us, that they want to be to be very active participants of Middle Corridor, basically connecting China and the European Union. But what we see under this current foreign policy is that basically we alienated our strategic partners like United States and the European Union, and basically we now have a kind of a new strategic alignment with countries like China. And then basically, if you look where the leaders of the Georgian Dream actually are visiting recently, this is Tashkent, Turkey, Azerbaijan, some other countries. And I think we also this also is some sort of result of the isolation of Georgia. And then another concept which we sometimes talk also very often, that where Georgia is heading actually. And there's sometimes there's a feeling that Georgia is also kind of maybe moving towards so-called Finlandization. Especially, we don't know what will be the outcome of the Russian-Ukrainian war, but that may affect Russia's neighborhood, including Georgia. And depending, there could be different scenario. And then another fourth concept, which you also use very often, this is so-called in-betweenness. Basically, therefore, this is a term which used for the countries who are between European Union and Russia. And next slide, please. And I think we can argue which of this, any of them actually describe the present foreign policy. But basically, historically, one of the major aim for Georgian foreign policy since its independence was the restoring territorial integrity, which is still quite important goal. And second one is Euro-Atlantic integration, which is formally there. Can we go next slide, please? But here we have some sort of paradoxes, basically, which is connected to the internal politics. One of the reason why Georgia is isolated is also, and why Georgia has actually turned away from the European perspective, is basically internal factor, and especially related to informal governance. And I think that one of the problem here was that that Georgian Dream still claims, even today, that they still declare that the Euro-Atlantic commitment is very important, and rhetorically they talk that they will join European Union after 2008 to 28, and they also want to restore the strategic links with the United States. But in reality, we see that Georgia gets more isolated, and it's actually, with anti-European and anti-Western rhetoric, becomes kind of how to say, not really very important strategically for the West at this moment. And I think this also creates some sort of risks for a small country like Georgia, who has vulnerability, especially we have a closer like a country like Russia. We don't know what will be Russia's motivation after Ukrainian war. And also the situation around Georgia is changing quite drastically, especially after the Second Karabakh War. Now we see that Georgia, who was one of the leader of the regional integration, basically lost its role, and now Azerbaijan is kind of shaping the South Caucasus security. And also, very interestingly, when we talk about the small states, basically we were talking about small states in terms of South Caucasus. Now Azerbaijan at least feels like that they are not anymore the small state, especially after they winning the war, but they are like middle power, and they because towards very strategic links with Turkey, Israel, and others, and of course, then gas and oil, they feel that they can do that. And there's also another thing which also kind of has a strong influence on Georgian foreign policy, which I call this so-called vendetta mechanism. And one of the problem basically, and I think this is not new if we look to the 35 years of Georgia's independence, that every government, when they come to the power, they try to persecute the former and try to marginalize the former elites. And I think we still have that. And this is what we see with Georgian Dream now doing with UNM, and what UNM was doing with Shevardnadze's political elites, and Shevardnadze doing under the against Gamsakhourdia. And I think until this problem is not really solved, I don't think that we can see the stability in Georgia, which also affects the foreign policy orientation of Georgia. And also, if we look at the public opinion versus government behavior, all public data survey shows that strong majority supports European integration. But I think that one of the reasons why Georgian Dream turned it away, that they feel that regime stability, and they try to avoid the regime change in Georgia, and because of that, they prefer that Georgia could stay as can return even back to the as a gray zone where we belonged maybe 15 years ago. Next slide, please. Yeah, and at the end, just to save time, I think one of the issues also, as I mentioned, that in order to stabilize the Georgian politics, and I think that this self-isolation of Georgia is also related to the internal politics. And I think that until Georgia manages to avoid this vicious circle, basically, and especially the political actors, each political actors, ruling parties, they always fear losing the power. And I think with the centralization authority, and this is what is happening now, Georgia, even though a lot of officials and the international organization talking about the backsliding of Georgian democracy, I think it's not really correct word. I think what we see is now not a backsliding, but this is consolidation of authoritarianism. This is where unfortunately, Georgia is moving. And I think this also, makes unclear Georgia's future, especially its European future. And I think situation is also very difficult because it seems like there is this consensus which was there on foreign policy for maybe 2 or 3 decades, I think is crumbling now. And we see that there's a difference among the political elites about the future of Georgian foreign policy. And I think this also creates some challenges here. And here also, basically, there's some sort of recommendation which I highlighted here. First of all, I think that in order to have some change in Georgia, I think it should happen internally. And of course, international support and international pressure is very important. But I think that if Georgians, we want to change something, it should be done inside the country. And then, of course, some other international actors, including EU, United States, they also can play some role. But I think what we see at this moment, there's no appetite from both as government as from opposition side that there can be some sort of discussion about some sort of national dialogue. I'll stop here, and I also would like if you could go for the next slide, please. Since organizers asked us to recommend some books, and this was the 4 years ago, we published together with Professor Jones and Tracy German a book on Georgian foreign policy. Some of you who might be interested to read more about Georgian foreign policy details, you can actually see this book, and I will be more than happy to talk to you during Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kornely, for highlighting very key points with regards of the specifics of Georgian case, Georgian vulnerabilities. And now, according to the schedule, we have time to let me engage in some form of discussion with you, and then we return to the audience and find out what kind of questions are there generated. And these questions I want to ask you are just to both of you, Neil and Kornely. Please reflect on the following point. So, can we say that norms, values do not dictate anymore the particular patterns and orientation of all states, not only small, but also small states? So, can we say that this transatlantic community, security community, is somehow belongs to the history? It will not resurrect anymore. And can we say, but Kornely, you eventually ended with the necessity to work on democratic institutions in Georgia, but does they matter? Do they matter actually still? And do they belong to the very pillars of the survival of small states? If so, well, let's just put additional arguments to it, especially in such a turbulent world. Does current Georgian government have enough incentives to think and work on democracy, on the survival of democracy in Georgia? Or state survival is not linked anymore with the values of democracy? That's one point. Another is that you mentioned this hedging in betweenness, the choice somewhere in between of balancing and bandwagoning, both of you actually. And while, if I understood correctly, Neil was very negative, or actually skeptical, the better word, towards this kind of hedging in betweenness attempts. And it reminds me the story of kings of Eastern Georgia, especially Kakhetian kings. Some of them managed to pledge the allegiance to three neighboring empires simultaneously: Russia, Ottoman, Persia, and eventually alienated all of them. And it ended with disaster. So, but Kornely also mentioned that new players are coming to the region, and it maybe gives room for maneuver to Georgian government. And so, room for maneuver, is it an argument in support of hedging policies or not? So few more words about the pluses and minuses of just too much balancing in between of powers without real adherence to some civilization or whatever choice.
Who
I
goes
stop here.
first?
Well, let's in this case start with Kornely and then
Okay.
go to Neil.
Okay, let's start with the last question then. I think I wrote together with Bizina Lebanese the article about this, and you can read it later. So basically, we don't argue that it's good. I think it's. I agree with Neil that it's risky in case of Georgia, because Georgia, as I said, is getting more isolated and it's self-isolating, especially in what Georgian government calls multi-vector foreign policy. It's a false multi-vector foreign policy, because we alienate created, as I said, our strategic partners. In order to have so-called multi-vector foreign policy, you should manage to have relations with both, which is not the case of Georgia. So I think that's also creates a lot of problem for Georgian government, including they have a issue of they have also issue of legitimacy internally and externally. So that also makes them more isolated and more, how to say, vulnerable to Russian or some other pressure as well. And we can see that, that even though Georgian government is trying to sell this rhetoric as a sovereignist and kind of, like mimicking that what Russia or Belarus or Azerbaijan government actually using in their rhetorics, but in reality, what we see is that Georgia is actually we see that Georgia is ideologically aligned with Russian style of governance, and I think this we see the convergence of this between these two governments. Even though Georgian government claims that we have nothing to do with Russia, then they talk that this is not about Russian influence. But what we see that Georgia was interesting case for West because it was permanent laboratory of change and for reforms. And if Georgia loses this image, which is happening right now, it's not getting interesting, especially for countries like United States, because it's become strategically insignificant. This is the word which last U.S. ambassador actually mentioned, and I think this is where we don't have a U.S. ambassador in Georgia, and now the Georgian Dream, who was fiercely attacking last two ambassadors, now they trying to beg U.S. administration, to restore the relations, which is not going to happen because of many things, even though they try to portray themselves that they are ideologically aligned with Trump administration. And I think about the first question about norms and values, I will say yes and no. Of course, there's a lot of biggest changes in international politics. We see now the return of so-called great power politics, and there's not so much room for maneuver for small states. That's why Georgia should be very careful because as we all know, even middle powers, they have some security vulnerabilities, and we see this especially if we listen Canadian Prime Minister when he made his famous speech when he was actually calling for alliance of the small and middle powers, basically against great power. This is where we're living because international order, which we had, rules-based order, is actually crumbling, right? So I think in that this is not a good news for small countries like Georgia. But at the same time, it doesn't mean that especially Georgia still formally it's a candidate country of European Union. And I think when we see that this change of attitude from United States and some other countries or internationally, there's still last bastion of democracy who's still using conditionality and other tools like European Union. I think for EU, it didn't give up with Georgia or with other countries. So they still talk about the enlargement in 2030. And I think it means that values are still important. And one of the 9 recommendation which EU gave to Georgia is Georgia should align with UN foreign and security foreign policy, where we actually failing, right? It's so I think this normative and value-based approach is still important for the European Union. So I think that's why this is still valid, and for small countries, I think this is very important to be aligned. Whatever is left from this international law, because we don't have any other, mechanism how to survive. And as Neil already mentioned, Georgia is very vulnerable at this moment, and we don't have armed forces, or we are not Israel, who can defend itself, or some other country. So I think that's why we all know that small states, unlike bigger states or middle powers, they cannot make mistake, because if a small state will make one mistake, I think that could be crucial. And when bigger states, they can make a few mistakes and they can even recover after these mistakes. And I think this is the core assumption which is which should be kind of discussed in Georgia. And maybe last one, and I'll stop here. And what we see now in Georgia, and the so-called imitation of this debates, which was launched by for Georgian government. Actually, they invited me for Monday for a foreign policy talk, which I declined for different reasons. But I think that one of what it shows us that basically we lacked real debates about foreign policy last 30 years. We had some, like monologues from different political parties, different political groups, but we never talked. What is the national interest of Georgia? How to define the Georgian interest? And this should be done on the level of politicians, civil society, and that was the role of think tanks actually, which we were hoping to do, but because of this present, repressive environment, which is actually impossible to do.
Thank you, Kornely. Neil, so is there still a ground for cautious optimism with regards of the international rule-based system? Kornely says it's crumbling. Maybe it's just a crisis and it may somehow refresh and resurrect.
Thank you for that wonderful question, David. You are talking to a descendant of Scottish Calvinist Protestants. We believe that optimism concerns the next world rather than this one. But leaving this aside and getting down to your details, first of all, let me go through the list here. You asked at the beginning what I thought about the role of norms and values. I think that the norm of one thing is that realism is a normative system as well as a power system. There are norms around realism, like sovereignty, like state autonomy, like the appropriateness of the use of force where threats are available. These are not, they are norms. It's just that they're a different kind of norms, which I would prefer not to get back into, by the way. But leaving that aside, in terms of what I think you were talking about was liberal norms and values, I think that their influence depends on external conditions. You know, when we had after World War I, the victorious powers created the League of Nations, which was extremely normative. It's about non-aggression. It was about management of the system as a whole in favor of everybody. This reminds me, of course, of the Congress of Vienna in 1815. It's the same thing. We start with, after every mess, we start with great ideals and with substantial liberal normative components. And then the system basically degrades. So the Concert of Europe resulted in the War of 1870, the Franco-Prussian War. The settlement of that war ultimately resulted in World War I. We had dealt with that. Then we had a gradual degradation in the 1930s, leading to World War II and the United Nations. Now, in the initial period after each significant rupture in the system, there is a lot of space for normative development and for the rule of law and for effectively the surrender of parts of state sovereignty to international institutions. But then the balance of power continues to shift back and forth. And as the balance of power shifts, as in, for example, the 1930s, it shifted in favor of Germany. That was destroyed, and we got World War II. It then shifted in favor of the United States, and we got the United Nations. And that didn't work terribly well until the 1990s when the Cold War ended. And we had this period of deep normative development across a wide range of issues. That depended, as I said in my presentation, on effectively the fact that you had a benign hegemon. The United States was interested in this. It was interested in the United States, in the United Nations. It was interested in international law. It was interested in international justice, etc., etc., etc. And here we are now. It is not interested in international law. Our president has said this. They're not interested in the UN. They're not interested in the UN Charter and the illegality of the unilateral use of force in international relations against other states, and so on. So I mean, Kornely talked about the cycle of Georgian politics. I'm talking about the cycle of international politics in a way. But we could go on and on with that. As for, let me think, second point, Kornely on internal democratic institutions. If you look at this history of small states, it is really important that these states have some form of internal democratic institutions. You look at Finland after World War II, it made its deal with the Soviet Union. It also had a robust democracy with complete buy-in from the electorate and the population as a whole. And I think Finland convinced the Soviet Union in the Russo-Finnish War that if you messed with them, you'd get hurt. And so they reached a compromise. But going right forward to Georgia, in order for Georgia as a nation to be credible in its dealings, whether it's balancing or bandwagoning with great powers, the interlocutors, the great powers, need to understand that the government speaks democratically for the nation. And we're not there yet in the case of Georgia. Now, on balancing, bandwagoning, hedging, you mentioned, David, the kings of Eastern Georgia. I think you mean Erekli too, and whoever it was before him. And I guess that is a perfect example. The last part, the period leading to 1795, was a perfect example of the risks of trying to embrace your threat. They embrace you. And that resulted ultimately in the absorption of Georgia into the Russian Empire. So I think Kornely is right again. Attempting to hedge is very demanding. You need, one, solid democratic support. Two, you need a leadership with some understanding of strategy and also of the national interest, which was a point that Kornely made. What is the national interest of Georgia? I think Kornely knows that I'm extremely skeptical of the concept of national interest because it is subjective and not objective. Leaving that old debate aside, I think most Georgians would agree, and I'm not really in a place to speak for them, but I assume that most Georgians would agree that they want to be A, independent, B, prosperous, see safe. So the measure of the moment with regard to the current government is if that is an appropriate definition of the national interest, the question is the government, does the government understand those essential elements of national interest? And if it does, is it pursuing them? And I leave that to you all to decide. I mean, I'm a foreigner, can I say?
Well, thank you for fascinating insights you just offer to me and to the audience. I wish we could continue. I just pick up one point which both of you made, that in order to balance or hedge more or less successfully, you need internal legitimacy and strong institutions. I mean, for the small state, it matters no less than for any state. But with that, let me now check the questions, if there are, from the audience. And I so far do not see the questions. Salome, can you just guide us in this process? There are no
Yes.
questions, or I don't see them?
No, we have just opened up the Q&A, so everyone
Uh-huh.
is welcome to type their questions in. You should see the Q&A on the bottom of the screen, right?
Yeah, I opened it, and so far it's
Yes.
empty.
So we'll just give a second to participants to ask their questions. What a
Okay.
fascinating discussion.
David,
I'm sure
before
you
that,
have other
can I
questions.
just mention something which I forgot to
Yeah,
before?
we have time. We don't have questions so far. Please.
Yeah, basically, it's also very interesting how they basically termed the West changing, including Georgia, because, we remember all that there was a NATO and EU information center, which was recently closed. And a lot of foreigners, actually, they were asking how come that, you have this, these are two independent organizations with different goals, and how come that Georgians see this in the kind of same way? But we had our explanation. But now what we see in this with this tensions, transatlantic relations, and basically, which begs a lot of questions, including do we have a West? Because we have now United States separately, European Union, and Europe together with UK. And basically, there's a lot of changes and challenges. So our concepts, which we had maybe 10, 15 years, they are a little bit getting outdated in many ways. This includes not only government, but also, its liberal political elites. And I think we need also to a little bit to follow these updates, which are not always positive. I agree. But these are the realities which is happening around Georgia or in Georgia. And we see the more authoritarian leaning countries. And this is not only democracies, they're learning from each other. We already see the authoritarian countries. They can also learn. And let's see, a good example here is Georgia, who now, has probably one of the worst, repressive laws. If you compare it to Azerbaijan, Belarus, I think they learn it from them. And as we see all these repressive laws, the Georgia's authoritarian trajectory is very fast if you compare it to Russia, Belarus, Azerbaijan. And one of the reasons is that there was already playbook. So they just, copy paste and maybe they edit to something there. So I think that's also gives us a lot of like room for to think about it. And as well, also, if Georgia becomes authoritarian states, I think if we look to the neighborhood, I think everybody will be very happy because Georgia was kind of island of democracy for decades. And if we looked around, maybe exception is Armenia here. We don't know what will the result of the next election there, but I think all our neighbors will be quite happy, and we see that they are quite happy, and they support the government. Look to the Turkish government reaction, Azerbaijani government. Of course, Russia is for Russia. What is happening in Georgia? It's like music in their ears, and also, this Georgia's turn towards Central Asia and China and all these things. I think this is also there's some changes there, and I think this also requires some sort of critical thinking. Inside the Georgian society and the real debates again. Yeah, I don't want to bring here party politics, but what is the Georgia's national interest in current circumstances? Except what Neil mentioned, I think I agree fully. That's still very relevant. But what should be the kind of the attitudes from Georgian society? And we also have to agree that Georgian society, we don't have now consensus on many issues, including foreign policy. And I think that's why we need these debates and to open up the debates, not like to closing down or oppress the people who have different opinion, which is happening right now. And the place for this discussion should be, of course, the universities. And they are the ones, or think tanks. And I think what we see in Georgia, basically, we're losing that space for discussion.
Okay, sorry. Thank you, Kornely, for your thoughts. I mean, they lead us to further discussions concerning maybe seeing the world in terms of additional round of authoritarian and democratic values and players clashing once again, or just how whether next administration, whoever it will be in the United States, will regain interest in United Nations, but maybe trust through the Euro-Atlantic community is damaged very seriously. It will not be easy to recover it. But anyway, here are questions coming. Our timing is also, we're running short of the time. And let me just read a few questions which emerged. So, Etuna Tsintsadze Mas asks us, given the lack of military capabilities and willing external partners to provide security for Georgia, some see versions of neutrality to make sense for Georgia's survival. I believe such proposals overlook that the current Russian leadership is still influenced by imperial imaginaries and exemplified by their war on conquest. Yes, it's understandable. So the question is, could you elaborate further on the best foreign policy route for Georgia? That's just a general question. We have to return to the topics we discussed. Another question, could you speak more about the example of Israel as a small state example? And what are the strategies Georgia may learn from Israeli case? Particularly to Neil, Philip Purifoy writes, fairly wealthy examples of European states. Does the Georgian experience possibly compare more close with other post-colonial small states in the global south, not necessarily to European small states? Yeah, so far that's the question we have. And as far as I know from Salome, we probably have just time to reflect on these questions, and that's it. Just one more question came. What lessons can we learn from Georgian history? David Aghmashenebeli had a successful balancing. Heracles II was less successful. How much agency and power do Georgian leaders have against in extremely challenging geopolitical circumstances? Well, I would say that David Aghmashenebeli's timing is just very far from modernity. It's just feudal world, and we will need to just outline the particularities of the feudalism, but do we have time for it? Anyway, so please, your reflection on these questions. And we have Salome, if I'm not mistaken, about 10 minutes, right?
That's right.
Yeah, please. Oh, Neil.
Okay, fine. Thanks. A couple comments on Kornely. What is the West? That's a very good question. I mean, is Hungary part of the West? Say, it's part of the EU, it's part of NATO. Is Bulgaria part of the West? I mean, the problem with the West is that is Japan part of the West? This is another question. So I think that we should forget the geographical definition of the West, and I think we should understand it as a particular set of values and norms about liberal democracy, about solidarity, about free markets, freedom of speech, etc. Now, we might ask immediately, does this conform to United States practice at the moment? But that's another presentation. Now, as for the contagion effect, I mean, and foreign policy, I was very struck by what Kornely said about the neighbors like Georgian Dream. This is true, and they like it, I assume, because Georgian Dream is emulating practices that they find preferable in terms of authoritarianism. So, is that contagion or is it attraction, if you will? I don't know. Now, on neutrality and Russia, generally speaking, neutrality is a possible option for hedging if the neighbors are either effective, the great power neighbors are effectively balancing each other out, so leaving space for the state in between to be neutral and get on with its life of I don't know, pursuing democracy, safety, and economic prosperity, say. But then there's Russia. First of all, I think that Turkey, and for that matter, China, accept that Georgia is within an implicit Russian sphere of influence. And so it seems to me that in that context, neutrality is a recipe for subjugation. The alternatives, that's a very hard question. In current geopolitical circumstances for Georgia, I think that what you need is, first of all, internal solidarity. Secondly, effective and intelligent leadership. You satisfy those two conditions, you've got a chance. You don't, you probably don't. On Israel as a small state example, that was one of my possible choices for examples of small state balancing, hedging, whatever, and so on. And I decided not to do it. In some respects, it's very interesting. The population of Georgia is, I think, unanimous, of Israel is unanimous in its defense of Israeli sovereignty and territory. I think, in other words, the government can rely on substantial support from the population as a whole. And by the way, most of them are trained in military matters, and many of them are in an active reserve, much of which is now actively engaged in conflict. So it is a porcupine as well. The other point about Israel is obviously it is highly dependent on United States assistance. I mean, not to put it directly, but where did Israel get the bombs that they destroyed Iran's steel industry from? That was yesterday. And I expect that a lot of that had to do with American military assistance. And I think one thing the Israelis really have to worry about here in the longer term is, given the shifting direction of American public opinion, how long can they reliably depend on American backstopping? On the post-colonial model, that's a really interesting question. And I think that there's a lot in it. I would have to think about that, though. Maybe Kornely can help me out. Lessons from Georgian history as to Georgian agency. I am a great fan of lessons from history. We have Agmashelnebeli, we have Erekle Tu, we have Tamar. And I think there are always lessons to be learned from history, but you have to take into account the context of events at the time that we're talking about. And I think that if you look at Agmashelnebeli and David and Tamar, the circumstances were much more flexible at the time. There was a space for Georgia to build and sustain power. But at the end of the day, Georgia is a small country. It was bigger then, by the way, but I mean, it is now surrounded by big neighbors in an international system dominated by big powers. And I think the conditions of Georgia today make it pretty clear that you cannot repeat Agmashelnebeli or Tamar, or even you might be able to repeat Erekle, but that, as I said, that did not end well. So, I mean, I'm sorry, I'm not being very helpful in strategies for the future. And that's because
Well, the reason is time limits. I mean, in 1 hour, how to cover
absolutely,
all these
yes.
complicated issues.
And we only have 13 minutes left, so I guess, or even less. So I'll quit now. Okay.
Thank you, Kornely.
Yes, David, since we have time pressure, I'll just try to answer first question, which Yetuna actually posed. I think this is quite legitimate question because, if you ask many Georgians, they may have different opinion about what is the best strategy for Georgia right now. And that's why I mentioned several times that we need these debates, really genuine debates, societal, based on society, to societal needs, and sometimes to hear something which may not like, and not to marginalize those voices which we don't like, or which was the case for decades. And but I think personally, I think Georgia has quite good chance right now, at least had good chance that this window opportunity which was opened after Russian invasion of Ukraine, and basically EU pledging another enlargement, and Georgia was seen as a permanent, a strong member of associated trio together with Ukraine and Moldova. And that was basically of our winning ticket. Basically, if Georgia ruling party didn't have its own region survival instincts, like we could actually continue that for, like accession talks. I know this is long term, nobody knows what will be the end of this because there's still a lot of questions about what to do with Ukraine, Moldova. Will they really succeed? A lot of questions there. But this was the only way in this current strategic circumstance, because I think we all know that NATO membership is absolutely out of the question right now, even for Ukraine, not to speak about Georgia. And I think another illustration of this option, that this option it could be good. That since we mentioned here Iceland, the Iceland is now trying to negotiate with the European Union, and they want to have another like plebiscite about this. So I think this creates some sort of similarity to Georgia. Iceland, of course, is much more developed country, and it will be no issue to become member of European Union if they decided so. But I think these transatlantic rifts, Trump administration aggressive posture towards Greenland and all the things, this pushes small states, even who were before not so enthusiastic about membership. We don't know what will happen with Norway eventually, because if they feel this kind of pressure, there might be some other countries. So I think this was the good examples where Georgia could emulate. But again, we have here the internal politics as well, that because I think that ruling party and oligarch behind of him, they just decided regime survival here is more important than, for instance, alignment with EU, because what EU is asking basically Georgia, if they follow this 12 recommendation or 9 recommendation, they lose the power. So they know this. And of course, the oligarch behind of the government, he's not happy. He's 70 years old. He doesn't want to immigrate from Georgia, probably. And this is, he just, decided that, since we have a state capture, there's no really opposition forces, or we don't have even second oligarch who could even potentially balance him. And I think this creates, this situation where we are. And I think what I'm afraid here is that, are we losing time? And is it because because this train for European integration is moving, maybe slowly, with bumpy roads with the Ukraine and Moldova, but they at least started some sort of negotiation with the EU. And if Georgia will stay isolated, I'm afraid that we may not be in that group, when this is what we see already, and we don't know when will be the next chances for Georgia. Now the Armenians, they talk that they also want to start some rapprochement with European Union. So maybe we will be stuck in the same group together with Turkey, maybe future Armenia, which is kind of non-starter probably, at least at this moment. And I think this is my reading of the current situation.
Can I just pop in there, if I may, David?
If Salome allows, I think her emergence is a signal that we are running out of time.
2 quick points.
Yes,
one is that like most of us, we are all very patient people. But as parents, we know that eventually we lose patience. And I think that Georgia probably has already lost the patience of the EU. I mean, basically, and also I think that it appears that your government, with respect, believes that the EU needs Georgia more than Georgia needs the EU. Whereas, in fact, it's exactly the reverse. And as Kornely says, there are lots of different options for enlargement, and I don't think that the EU is terribly interested in enlargement at all at the moment. So, I think that Georgia has put itself back in the pack quite a far away, and it will take a long time to get back from that, even if Georgia decides to begin the process. I'll stop there.
Well, thank you once again for very interesting discussion. And I think we achieved what I actually expected, that through this discussion, new topics, new themes emerged with regards of Georgia's politics, internal, foreign, future of the West, and so on and so forth. But it's up to Salome to continue in this direction. And thank you once again, Salome, and to the Association of Georgia in the United States for this opportunity to meet old friends and discuss interesting topics. I hope the audience was also satisfied.
Thank you so much, everyone. What a fascinating discussion. And I think it's quite telling that this is a topic that's going to need multiple different perspectives and hopefully more time than just an hour and a half. There's so much to speak about, and we hope to spark these conversations in an academic setting and then bring them out to the general public, and there will be some connections that are made. We invite everyone to follow us on our social media, on LinkedIn, as well as Facebook, wherever you're more active in which domain. We also have a website that you can see on the screen here. And our next session is actually going to continue this topic that in some ways was started today. We're going to meet on April 26th. Actually, I will correct what is on the screen really quickly. It's going to be after Easter on April 26th, and it will be focused on Georgia and the Black Sea. So we will still continue to talk about the international aspects, Georgia's role in Black Sea's role in Georgia's history, and also as the space for strategic space for great power competition. So these international relations theories that we heard today will be very relevant also next time. We will have guests that are continuing to bring their perspectives. We will have Nat Asabanadze, who is the former Georgian ambassador to the European Union, and Natia Seskuria, who's the associate fellow at the Royal United States United Services Institute in the UK. And it will be moderated by Natia Jankwetadze, who's the director of the program on Georgian Studies at the Davis Center at Harvard University. So we had a wonderful group of speakers today. Thank you, David, so much for the moderation. I will also flag the resources for everyone if you click the resources below, but you can also see them in the webinar resources, and you can also go to scan this QR code on your screen. Georgian Association is experimenting with something new, which is a bookshelf where you can see all of our speakers and moderators can suggest additional readings, and we post them there if it's a book that you can purchase. And we will post this recording on YouTube. And on YouTube, we also include in the description additional resources that have been shared here, whether it's an academic journal publication or a blog post or a video from the previous sessions. You will see some short movie suggestions and so forth. So again, it's meant to be an interactive experience, and we really appreciate you joining us today. Again, thank you so much to our speakers, and we hope to see you next time.
Thank you very
Thank you.
much.
Have a great day.
Until next time.
Until next time.